Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis with the Daily Beast. He's their senior columnist.
Friend of mine and friend of America.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for rating and reviewing the show. Thank you for supporting long-form conversations like this one on Patreon, patreon.com/Matt Lewis. And I'm excited to have back today a returning guest, David Frum. He's a staff writer at The Atlantic and the author of 10 books, most recently Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy. David Frum, welcome back to the news.
Matt, it's a pleasure to rejoin you.
Well, so let's go to the title and the subtitle of your book. It feels like the institutions have held, and that Donald Trump is not going to go quietly, but that democracy, held. Are you optimistic? What's your take on that?
I am optimistic, but I don't think we should minimize what's just happened here. The nature of the Trump experience has been that we say things are good when things are actually unbelievably bad compared to anything we've ever seen before in American history. And the idea that you would have a president defying the results of an election for weeks, abetted to the last minute by much of his party, that's extremely disturbing. And I think I am also disturbed by, look, we've had some good news from the election. We saw that voting systems are much more robust and reliable than they were in the year 2000 with Bush v. Gore. But what we've also seen is we've got some systematic unfairnesses built into the way votes are allocated in the first place. So it's really possible for a minority of the population to control a majority of the political power. Let me say one last sentence about this. Trump's plan for 2020 was to use Republican majorities in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, maybe other places, to swing the election to his favor. Why were there Republican majorities in those state legislatures in the first place? Because in all three of those states, Democrats had, in the last two elections, won a majority of the votes cast. But the gerrymanders were so powerful in those states that you could then lever anti-majority votes at the state level into Trump's hope of an anti-majority outcome in the presidential election.
All right, I want to put a pin on that conversation. I want to come back to it because I think that's a separate conversation from the other part of what you're talking about, which is, should we be celebrating or should we still be worried? And I think that if this thing had been closer, right? If instead of 4 states, it had been 1 state, and let's say some of these state officials, the Georgia Secretary of State, for example, or what if the Republican legislature in Pennsylvania had decided they were going to send a new slate of delegates, what I guess what I'm getting at here is, like, I don't think we should say, like, because we survived this, like, woo, it was always predestined. Like, this could have, like, Trump's trying to raise money, yes, but he also, like, was testing the system, and if it had been a little closer, or if we'd had 1 or 2 like local officials who were not as principled, it could have gone the other way.
Right. And it raises some questions now for the future of post-Trump politics. Trump obviously wants to stick around in some important way, whether that means literally running for office again in 2024 or simply kneecapping any Republican who emerges too early and trying to remain the dominant figure. But the consequence of that is it makes it difficult normally when a party takes another in a series of bad losses, it does some rethinking. And what should be happening right now is Republicans should be looking at the recent record, looking at 2018, looking at 2020, and saying, look, we've got some good news here. Despite the pandemic, we were pretty competitive. We won, what's the figure, 27 out of 28 or 28 out of 29 of the most competitive seats, and we elected a slate of women. We did well with in some minority constituencies, so there's good news, but we are not making a national majority here. We have to think about how to retool to do that. Now, that process is now going to be sabotaged because of the need to defend Donald Trump and because Donald Trump will go out of his way to undermine any Republican politician who tries to do that work.
Yeah. Well, not only that, I mean, and you mentioned 2018 and 2020, but heck, 2016 and 20, there and 2008. I mean, there were a lot of elections. When's the last time? I guess 2004 is the last time Republicans won the popular vote in the presidency. Is that right?
Exactly.
So that's a long time. So in a normal world, Republicans would be doing some like soul searching and having that come to Jesus moment, but that's not going to happen, and Trump's not going to let that happen. Absolutely.
Right. And there's a really important debate among Republicans, because what you can see is, look, Trump showed a possibility. You can imagine a Republican Party that says the future is to be a white, blue-collar party. And that means, becoming a little bit more like a European center-right party, more nationalist, more immigration exclusionist, but then much more willing to spend money, much more protective of social programs like Medicare and Social Security. That's a path forward. And the other path forward is for Republicans to say, look, we did pretty well better than expected among Latinos. And look at the outcome of the racial preferences referendum or initiative in California, where the anti-racial preferences forces did very well with Asian Americans. Maybe there's a possibility of a kind of pan-racial upmarket party of markets and enterprise. Those are choices. And I mean, I would have my preference, but those are both rational choices. But you have to, where the Republican Party is now, which is it's taking the ethnic message of Trumpism and joining it to the economic message of McConnellism. And that is a formula for permanent minority status, and therefore having to subvert democratic norms all the time because you can't compete.
Yeah. Well, since you mentioned Mitch McConnell yesterday, we're taping this on Wednesday. Yesterday, Mitch McConnell, came out and said, basically Joe Biden is the president-elect. I'd love to get your take on that. Like, does that matter? Is that a turning point? And just your take on McConnell in general.
Well, McConnell made that statement on the same day that President Trump made his most extreme attack yet on the Georgia State Republican Party. And someday we'll find out. It would be interesting to know which was cause and which was effect. That is, did Trump go off because he knew McConnell was going to endorse the reality of the Biden win? Or did McConnell accept Biden because as a reaction to Trump attacking the Republican candidates in Georgia? But either way, you now have a clear split in interest between McConnell's desire to remain majority leader and Trump's desire to punish the Republican Party, and maybe also his ego need not to see other Republicans win. I mean, if Republicans do well in Georgia, it certainly gives the lie to his claim that he lost Georgia because of some unfairness. It looks like what happened was old-fashioned ticket splitting, that a lot of Georgia Republicans said, I wanted Republican Senate, but I want to see the back of President Trump, and that's very hurtful to him. But we've got now this kind of hanging in the balance result that in Georgia, where instead of looking forward to this and saying, this could be a good balanced outcome here, a repudiation of Donald Trump, but the Democrats have the House of Representatives. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I hope we can edit that.
Yeah, we can.
Instead of a result where you get some kind of balance, what you've now created is you've inserted a loyalty test to Trump into the Georgia Senate races, where you would think it doesn't belong, but where it's going to dominate.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think he's made it. These Republicans running in Georgia, Loeffler and Perdue, I mean, obviously, like if they could say Joe Biden is going to be president and you need us to help check him to provide balance, that would be that would be like a traditional and a pretty compelling message. But they can't really say that because that would offend Donald Trump. And so he's really made it difficult for them I guess that's just an obvious point, but he's not
No,
doing them any favors.
it's an obvious but such an important point, because the Georgia Senate races are going to be decided by conservative-leaning suburban women in and around Atlanta, Augusta, Savannah, right? Because the countryside, the white rural vote is overwhelmingly Republican. There's an important black vote in Georgia that has been intensely mobilized, and it's intensely Democratic. And the Trump idea, and the Linwood idea that it was massive numbers of votes in black urban centers that swung the 2020 election is wrong. What the election was swung by was Biden overperformed among women who would normally have been open to casting a Republican ballot. So with Trump gone, the Republicans would have an opportunity to bring those women back into the party, at least, to balance in a balancing way. And now Trump is trying to destroy that. And that is very ominous, not just for the immediate future, and not just for the Republican Party, but for the whole shape of American politics in the 2020s. How do we get back to something more like a normal political system where where right and left balance each other in a fruitful way?
So, we've talked about this for years. I wrote a book about it. You've written several books. But obviously there were many trends that led to the rise of Donald Trump. I think like reality TV was one of them. I think Twitter was one of them. Probably like cable news and talk radio. There are a lot of things at play. And I think that, these trends are to some degree bipartisan, but for some reason, it was the Republican Party that got taken over by Trump. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on why the Republican Party was more susceptible to this, because I was surprised. I voted for Marco Rubio in 2016, and I don't know, there's these videos of like Rubio and Nikki Haley and Tim Scott like on stage in South Carolina. Like that could have been the Republican Party that would have won these suburban, we'll call them soccer moms. And the Republican Party like intentionally chose to go a different direction. What are your thoughts about like why they made that conscious choice and what that says?
Well, they didn't want to do it. Trump beat them. Trump really forced his way onto the party. It wasn't effective, but there was real resistance to him in 2016. And this is going to be important for the future. Why did it fail? Because at least in 2016, Trump didn't have good answers, but he talked about real things. I mean, I went and looked it up at the time for one of the things I did. He used the word opioid more than all other Republican candidates put together. He vowed that he would not touch Medicare. The other Republicans were talking about getting rid of the Affordable Care Act, which had, from a design point of view, there are many objections that Republicans had, but Republicans also have pre-existing conditions and want to be protected from their consequences. And he talked skeptically about immigration, which was a rising theme in Republican politics in the 21st century. The Republican Party pre-Trump had this split between the values and interests of its voters and the messages of its candidates. And the candidates were responsible to a very small number of people who wrote checks and ignored the very large number of people who cast votes in primaries. And the question for the Republican future is especially, will they take on board the need for a modern healthcare message? I think that's the thing that the Democrats did so well on in 2018, that you have to restore the Democrats at least one House of Congress, or else the Republicans will take away coverage for pre-existing conditions. That was powerful. And I think it's time that the health begins by saying the debate over the Affordable Care Act is over. The debate over reforming the Affordable Care Act has begun. Republicans as a group and Democrats as a group have different kinds of interests about what they want to see. But Republicans are going to accept the promise of universal health care coverage. And once you do that, you can then begin to start debating the real issues of the 2020s. And there are going to be some important divides. Let me just point to one right away that is coming up. If the Republicans hold the Senate, which you have to assume is the more probable outcome, there's not going to be able to be any climate legislation. So the Biden administration, which is going to be very green, is going to try to deal with the climate issue entirely by regulation. And they've got a lot of regulatory tools to do that. The Supreme Court gave them permission back in the Bush years to regulate greenhouse gases as pollutants. So that's going to lead to irrational, herky-jerky outcomes and non-market outcomes. And so, the way is open for a Republican market-based environmental policy. The way is open for Republicans to say, yeah, we're going to have universal coverage, but we're going to look out for the interests of middle-class people as well as the poorest people. There are things to fight about for the 2020s, not culture war battles left over from 1968.
Do you think, maybe Mitch McConnell would be open to this? He's somebody who negotiated with Joe Biden during the Obama presidency. He knows Biden. And could it be in Mitch McConnell's interest, actually, to move past the gridlock?
Well, it depends on how Mitch McConnell defines his interest. If Mitch McConnell wants to be the kind of majority leader who's remembered for his legislative accomplishments, then yes, there are things to do. But he may feel that every day I'm majority leader is one more day that I'm majority leader. And I like the exercise of power for its own sake. That he may just have lost interest in those kinds of things. And that would be, that would be a shame, because there is a possibility of fruitful compromise. And, McConnell's power could be welcome to Biden. That Biden you have this very active progressive left in the Democratic Party. And Biden does not have the kind of emotional clout with them to control them. So if he had two houses of Congress, he would have to fight the progressive left, and he would find that a hard fight. As is, he can tell them all the time, if McConnell holds on to the Senate, hey, nobody is more with you than me. But unfortunately, that bastard McConnell, he won't let us progressives do what we want to do. So I have to make a lot of disgusting trades. Don't be mad at me, be mad at McConnell.
All right, I want to go back to where something you said very early on, which was about gerrymandering. And I guess my concern about gerrymandering is not that it's not that it creates like an unfair system, because I think it's fine. We don't live in a direct democracy kind of situation, right? I believe in the Electoral College, and maybe it could be reformed, but I don't necessarily think that the winner of the popular vote has to become president. I do think it becomes a problem when it becomes a regular occurrence where the loser of the Electoral College becomes president. And my concern with the gerrymandering issue is not that it's like unfair to Democrats or whatnot, but it's that when you have gerrymandering, it means that you have all these safe seats. And so like Republican congressmen, for example, don't have to worry about winning a general election. They have to worry about, protecting their right flank in a primary. So to me, that's the bigger concern about gerrymandering. But do you disagree with that?
No, I think that's a great point and really important. But I agree with you about, look, direct democracy is a fantasy anyway, because you can't look at 330 million people and then aggregate their preferences in some way that gets you the will of the people. Just reality doesn't work that way. So it's always kind of impressionistic, and the political outcomes are always deviating from, they depend on, there's no will of the people independent of the rules by which the will of the people is realized. All of that said, when you get consistent deviations where people who have organized themselves into one party consistently get more votes, and people who have organized themselves into another power consistently get more power, that system becomes illegitimate after a time, and it breeds a demand for radical responses. And I was there in 2000 when Bush won in Florida, and President Bush, or President-elect Bush, he experienced the outcome of the 2000 election as a tremendous problem. And when you go back and look at the speech that on the day of the Supreme Court decision, December something of 2000, Vice President Gore made a very gracious, very patriotic speech, and then George Bush made a speech in which he understood this is a problem, that I don't have a popular vote majority. First time since the 1880s that the winner of the Electoral College did not also have a popular, at least plurality behind him. But as you say, it's becoming a pattern, and it's becoming an even more ominous pattern at the state level, where you will have again and again one party win more votes in the states and the other get not only majorities, but sometimes, as in Wisconsin, huge majorities in the state legislature. That can't go on. And it's an invitation to the real risk in a situation like that is that the bigger side becomes pessimistic about politics and moves from doing politics, moves into the streets.
Yes. And I'm pretty sure it was the case that for a long time, this actually favored Democrats, like probably up until the Republican Revolution in 1994. Democrats were like punching above their weight. I mean, they were probably, overrepresented. And maybe that led to some of the backlash that we're experiencing now, which would actually just prove your point.
Well, you're very right about that. What happened basically in the civil rights era, as Black participation rose and rose and rose, that Democrats in shifting states, places like North Carolina, would use their Black voters as a kind of reservoir of power and then allocate them to preserve their Democratic white incumbents who would become somewhat more liberal, but could still be competitive with white voters. And they would then apportion Black voters in a way that didn't allow the Black population of those states to have much representation from among their own and cut short the careers of ambitious Black politicians. So as you say, in the 1990s, Republicans, there was a de facto alliance between Republican politicians and Black Democrats to use the Voting Rights Act and other measures to say, you know what, we're going to have districts that are majority minority so that Black people in North Carolina can elect a congressman or two. And the courts got heavily involved. And then basically what happened in the 21st century is the courts retreated from supervising gerrymanders. They just got out of the business. And you can see why it got very complicated and fractious. And the Voting Rights Act began to collapse. And the voting by race became more polarized. And then the last thing that happened was Republicans had such a huge year in 2010 that they were able to gerrymander in 2011 without fear of Democratic retaliation. And so we had in 2010 a gerrymander unlike anything I think we've seen since the coming of the civil rights era. And the Republicans did well enough in 2020 to preserve most of the gerrymanders of 2010.
Which was a really amazing thing and a big surprise, right? I mean, a lot of us thought that the Republicans would not perform as well as they did, especially if Donald Trump were to lose. So that is an interesting outcome that will, again, last for years probably.
Mm-hmm.
I want to shift gears and ask you about your thoughts on COVID, which is obviously partly a political story. Right now we're nobody can. It's dark times, but we see on the horizon the vaccine. Of course, the question is, will people take it, and will it be a political issue? Where are you at on that?
Well, a lot of my thinking on the medical part of this was formed by the accident that a neighbor of mine in the part of Canada where I spend the summer was one of the key figures in the Canadian vaccine program. He had led Canadian AIDS research in the 80s, and he was sort of the coordinator of the COVID response. And I saw him a few times over the summer, and he was just incredibly optimistic about what the science would hold. And he kept saying, there's going to be a vaccine by the end of the year. And he also kept saying, don't worry about the scientists. We're going to have a vaccine. Worry about the politicians. Are they going to be able to deliver the vaccinations? The vaccinations are the problem, not the vaccine. And I got him to write an article for The Atlantic. So The Atlantic is on record. There's a lot of pessimism on cable TV, but The Atlantic is on record saying there will be vaccines by the end of the year. And here we are. Now we face the vaccinations problem. I think one thing needs to be said about this incredible scientific accomplishment is what a vindication it is for the vision of a globalized world. That while we were doing, the most angry kind of national politics, people from the United States and Germany and Britain and Canada and France and Germany, and by the way, Chinese scientists and Israeli and Indian, they were cooperating in a way that really is a vision of how the 21st century should be. And indeed, one of the things my neighbor said to me was, it was just amazing how the Chinese scientists ignored their political masters to share information, because they understood their political masters could not understand the science. And so they would put things online, the structure of the COVID. They were the first to map the exact shape of the COVID virus, and they just put that out there, knowing that no one could stop them because no one could understand what they were doing. No one with the guns could understand what the people with the lab coats were doing. And so that is an inspiration, but also a challenge. Can the rest of our social life do as well as our scientific community did, to get vaccinations into arms and to get the economies moving again in a way, especially to help our young? I mean, the thing that I am most haunted by is imagine the marginal student in elementary or high school. The person who's just, with good help and structure, maybe a lot of it from outside the home, can just hang on, finish high school, get some community college, and make one kind of life. Those are the people who are dropping out of high school because of COVID, or who are having their reading in first, second, third grade damaged because of distance learning. And we are going to be seeing the traces of this epidemic on their achievement for the next 50, 60 years.
So, while I have you, you've been on this podcast several times in the past few months, but I wanted to ask you just a couple bigger questions, maybe. One of them is about your career and the resilience and like what you've learned. And so, I think obviously, so you were a supporter of the Iraq War, and that turned out to be, for a variety of reasons, messy. You were very early a critic, I think, of the direction the Republican Party was headed. A lot of us thought you were too squishy, and I don't know if you got lucky or or if you saw something that we didn't. Yeah. But I think maybe you've been vindicated. Some of your concerns have been vindicated. But I just love to have you reflect on, I guess, a couple decades now of being in the national, driving the national conversation.
Well, that's very characteristically generous of you. Thank you. And thank you for that assessment. We are never good judges of our own lives and our own work. We're way too charitable with ourselves. And I'm sure there are many critical things that could be said and would be true. But here's how it looked to me. And part of it, this is a matter of just the generation I belong to. I think from one of the formative experiences of my life was being in my late teens and early 20s and finding that there were really smart people around me who believed a lot of things that just didn't work. If you controlled the price of oil, you didn't solve oil shortages, you created oil shortages. If you controlled rents in cities, you didn't put poor people into housing, you locked poor people out of housing. If there was an inflation and the government tried to dictate what wages and prices would be, that wouldn't stop the inflation, that would aggravate the inflation. And so for me, I was part of that cohort for whom people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were saying things that were powerfully true about the world that we saw. And that was very inspiring. And Reagan said something else that was powerfully true, which is he promised that the Cold War would not last forever, that communism was founded on a monstrous lie, almost as terrible in its way as Nazi ideology, and that this lie could not endure. And he assured us also that inside these countries, we're not robots, but people like ourselves who yearn for the same freedom that we yearn for. And so for me, the years 1989 to the early 90s were this summit of hopefulness in my political life, and not just for what happened in the communist world, but all over the place. I mean, democracy came to places like Chile and South Korea and Taiwan, and apartheid ended in South Africa. And we had multi-party democracy came to Mexico and India, and we had this vision of this world as it could be. And I think a lot of, when you think about where did Iraq come from, I mean, that impetus, probably the excessive hopes of the years 1989 to 1994 that led people like me to say, well, if it worked everywhere else, why can't it also work in the Middle East? And with just a little more, we used American power in 1990 and got some good results. With a little more American power a decade later, we can get even better results. And that was arrogant, and it was wrong, and it failed. But what also happened was all the answers that we had, my cohort, not me, my cohort had for the problems, I think they were right. They really worked. It really worked. But, I would say that if you cure an infection with antibiotic, that doesn't mean you take antibiotic for the rest of your life. Now you need to eat right and exercise and wear a seatbelt and do other things. And so what happened after 1990 was we had a series of new problems to which the insights of the 1970s and 80s, they didn't help. I mean, what happens when free trade makes a lot of traditional manufacturing jobs redundant and especially has an impact on men, and painkillers become easily available, and those men who are displaced from work, who have aches and pains that if they had a purpose in life they would overcome and go to the work, now without a purpose they take the painkillers. What do we do about that? Well, Margaret Thatcher didn't have answers to that question. She never thought about that question. It didn't exist in her political life. And so for me, the job of politics is to understand the questions are constantly changing, and you need to change with them. And it's not a matter of loyalty tests. That we are loyal to persons. We're not loyal to ideas. Ideas are only useful as long as they continue to solve real problems in the world.
Why do you think you were quick to recognize the changing questions, whereas a lot of very smart, successful people kept going to that well? They stuck with zombie Reaganism.
I think there are a couple of things. One was one from my journalistic life and one from my private life. I was early worried about immigration. I was an early immigration hawk, and I did a lot of reporting in the period 2005 to 2008 on the consequences of immigration. I put some of that in a book I published in 2007. So you'd go to a place like suburban North Carolina, and you'd meet parents who, would have their first kid would go to would start school where there were no English language learners, and their third kid would finish a school where 1/3 were English language learners, and the family was radicalized by that. But then you'd be in that place, and you'd see a whole bunch of other kinds of social problems, like furniture manufacturing was disappearing from North Carolina, and you saw, the beginnings of the drug epidemic, and what you realize is I couldn't even begin to conceptualize. I mean, other than my immigration view, I realized, which I hold, that this is inadequate to the problems that this town is facing. We need something else. And the second thing I think that put me on a different path was, my family has a family business, and I was somewhat involved in that business until as my father was getting ill in the later 2000s. And so I was sort of in the markets in October of 2008 when the whole financial system seized up. And there was a day when General Electric couldn't borrow money. And it was terrifying. It was terrifying. And I came out of that thinking, you cannot, the many people who are my friends and smart people would say, just let the system work. And I saw the system not working. If we have many more days like these days we're having in October of 2008, we are going to have the Great Depression on our hands and all the chaos of that. And I think back of it all, and this is maybe a more personal reflection. So my family emigrated from Poland to Canada in 1930, my father's family. My father was born in Canada in 1931 and grew up speaking English and having a very comfortable and successful life. Of his cousins, 65% were murdered. And had my father's parents not made the decision they made in 1930, my father would have been murdered when he was 11 or 12 years old. And one of the things that is weird about that is when you're young, you never think about that at all. And as you get older, the past comes closer. And the possibilities of chaos and really bad outcomes have become ever more vivid to me in my old age, and the determination to use the power of human reason and generosity to hold that chaos at bay, that's become starker and starker and starker for me. And so in some ways, I've become more conservative because I'm more concerned about maintaining social peace. But I've become less conservative in that I'm less attached to a set of formulas from the Heritage Foundation as a way to maintain social peace. I think you have to think for yourself, how are we going to maintain social peace in a world in which chaos is so potentially real?
I wanted to ask you, part of your story involves, being a supporter of Ronald Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
And, this sort of dovetails with the Anne Applebaum,
Yes. Did you
book,
talk to
right?
her?
I didn't. I heard you and your wife talk to her. I listened to that podcast, which was fabulous. But I've actually never met her or
Oh my
talked to
God.
her. I'd love to do that someday. But in the era of Donald Trump, I think there've been it's been two different lenses through which we view Reagan. One lens is, let's hold up Reagan as this optimistic freedom fighter who, was decent and marshaled rhetoric to take down the evil empire. And that's the viewpoint that I'm very sympathetic to. However, there's another viewpoint that says, no, Reagan was the forerunner to Donald Trump, that this is like fruit of the poison tree, that Reagan used the Southern strategy to win election, and Trump is just the natural, next phase of this. Where do you come down on that?
Peggy Noonan tells this story. She cleans it up a little bit. She makes the fluid in the story water, but it's not water, as you'll hear in a second. After Reagan was shot and he was in the hospital, he lost control of some of his bodily functions, and he had difficulty going to the bathroom. Won't surprise you. And senior aides came to visit him in the hospital for some work, and they found Reagan on his hands and knees in the bathroom cleaning around the toilet because he had missed. And he did not want the nurse to clean up after him. And the president of the United States, the nurse who's been nearly assassinated, the nurse will be delighted to clean up after. Absolutely not. The nurse is not cleaning my mess up after me. So if you can imagine Donald Trump in that situation, that's one story, I think, flushes the idea that Ronald Reagan had anything to do with Donald Trump. If you can imagine Donald Trump cleaning up his own urine because he was not going to let some other person do that work for him. And I think for me, the essence of Reagan, and the reason Reagan was able to take conservative ideas that seemed so extreme and unpalatable when Barry Goldwater offered them, was because people at some deep level knew this is a man who, when he misses the toilet, will clean up the mess himself rather than make some person who has to do it. He's a decent person. He's got empathy. He cares about people. And whatever you think about his ideas, and maybe they turn out to be better ideas than you thought, you can see a human bond with this man. So I think there are things, I in the 80s, when I was a younger person, I was more radical in those days and thought Reagan didn't go far enough on some important things, especially budget balancing and spending cutting. And maybe that was even right, but you can see that Reagan pulled together an American majority, and he pulled it together in the only way you ever can, by appealing to what is generous in America, and that is something that Donald Trump couldn't do. And I think one more thing, I think a lot of people talk about politics, conservative, liberal. This is the one thing that people are really interested in politics have in common. We think politics is about ideas and policies, and it's really, yes. To some extent, that's the matter, but it's driven by other things. And there's a saying that people have: facts don't care about your feelings, but it's a much deeper truth that feelings don't care about your facts, and that people felt a certain way about Reagan, and that gave them trust in him and a willingness to experiment with what he was advising, because at some level they felt he cares about me, and so whether he was right or wrong about this or that thing, that he leaves behind a good place in American politics. People could be proud, even people who disagreed with him could be proud about it, and could find things in his presidency to admire. I think
Yeah.
it's going to be a much harder job with Donald Trump.
Right. And I think part of it, the notion that Reagan was led inevitably to Trump, there were several years that passed between 1988. I'm not great at math, but we went through, uh, you know, some other presidencies, some 3 2-term presidents in between that. So it's hard to connect the dots. And I would also say the Peggy Noonan book about Reagan, I mean, the biography one
Mhm.
is called "When Character Was King,"
Yeah. That's what the
and
story that she tells the story. As I say, in her case, he spilled water from the tap, but that's not what happened.
yes, and it's "When Character Was King." I mean, in the Trump era, it's almost a subtweet of Donald Trump, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the title of the book says it all.
Yes. So I think there are. I mean, there are things. There are people, obviously, in the Reagan coalition who became Trumpists, but I think you need to understand. You need to understand the fact of change, and um, and I think just because people live longer, the pace of change is slowing down. So there you have lots of people in American life now to whom the '70s were real, whereas 100 years ago, there were not many people in the 1920s who thought to whom the 1870s were real. So things slow. The pace of change is slowing down, but change is the great fact of political life, and we have a whole lot of new problems. I mean, Reagan would. What would Reagan think if he were alive? Well, he'd be in 130, so or whatever. But we don't know. But what
Yeah.
we can know is what can we. The question is what can we learn from him? And great politicians are like great artists. They leave behind a lot of different ways of looking at their work.
Well, speaking of great artists, I want to talk about writers and you as a writer. And by the way, I mean, David, it's pretty clear, I think, that this is a hodgepodge
Yeah,
podcast. I'm jumping around, man. We
yeah,
talked
no,
about
it's really interesting. Thank you.
Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump and COVID and Ronald Reagan. And there's a lot that I want to ask you that I'm not gonna for the sake of time. But uh, for my own edification, I'm just curious as a writer how you come up with ideas, what what the process is, like where the magic comes from, because I think anyone who is able to be a public intellectual or thinker or a commentator and do it for a career um, is doing something right. And you have to have a process. And I'd love to know if maybe I could steal some of some of yours.
Well, first, a personal thing. I think I've had a very herky jerky career. Had a lot of different jobs. Been fired from some of them. I've always had a very stable personal life. I've been married to the same person now for close to 35 years. 3 kids. We've been living in the same house for a long time. We've had a succession of dogs. All are related to one another. And I think that for writers, I mean, a predictable way of life, I think is really important because you're dealing in your intellectual life so much with things that upset and are strange and are difficult that patterns and order in
Yes.
the personal
There's
life.
this there's a Flaubert quote: "Be regular and orderly in your life, so that you may be violent and original
Oh,
in
that's
your
brilliant.
work."
I've never heard that. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. That's
I hope it's not apocryphal,
no,
but it's a
that
good
sounds
one.
no, it's too good to be apocryphal. Oh, so I think that yeah, I completely concur with that. And then second, for me, and I don't. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, so I often appear to write fast, but that's only because I think slow. So I think about what I'm going to say. Long when I sit down to write, I'm not really writing. I'm actually typing. I'm the and when I start, I usually know how I'm going to begin a piece and how I'm going to end the piece. And when I'm writing anything long, I try to write the last page at the beginning. So I know it's like swimming across choppy water. If you can
Yeah.
see the dock, you're less likely to drown.
This is begin with the end in mind, right? It's like a Stephen Covey
Right.
ism.
Yes. Very good. And then I think one of the things you learn just from doing it is how long things need to be. And one of the things I really love about Twitter is that Twitter has taught us that many of the things that we used to think were op-eds are in fact tweets. And but it also need, and I do a lot of Twitter, and that's where I focus a lot of sort of like a quick point that something you would once have watered down to 800 words, just do it in the 2 sentences that are all it really needs. But then also develop your thought, really think things through and try to be fair to people with different points of view. To anticipate what the best arguments against what you're going to say. And you don't literally say, I think X, here's what a smart person who disagreed with X would say. That's like too much like a ping pong game. But be mindful of what a critic of what you were saying would say as you are saying it, and then anticipate those.
Mark Levin is going to come in here. He's going to dazzle you with all this talk about a code red. But yeah, you don't have to necessarily shoot it down. But if it's in your head, you're gonna, David, one lesson I learned though is sometimes it's good to not have a bulletproof idea, because then it could take off on Twitter if people start, if you answer every potential criticism, then it leaves people no room for a conversation.
Yeah, I think I also think you have to not take things personally. And so, I think this is maybe a key to the modern social media world is, if people are reading your work, there are some people who are not going to like it. And if there are people who don't like your work, some of them are not going to like you or think they don't like you. You just have to live with that. It goes with the job. And compared to some of the negative things that happen in other jobs, it's hardly the worst thing in the world that can happen. So you just have to like slough off a lot. And the stable private life helps that. This is my current Twitter banner. It shows me reading Andrew Cotter's book to my 2 dogs. And, the motto that has always inspired me is if you need a friend, want a friend in Washington, get a dog. I have 2 dogs, so I'm all set.
No, I think that's so true though, right? If you are deriving your identity solely from the work, then like if you have a bad work day, you have a bad day. But if you've got a loving spouse and Fido the dog and maybe a couple hobbies,
Right.
then that will sustain you through dry spells or downtimes.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And we all have our own religious commitments. And again, I mean, those, if nothing else, those give you perspective because they remind you that the universe was here a long time before you, and it's going to be here a long time after you.
And not only do I think that what you're talking about could make you more resilient in terms of enduring in this career, but it might keep you from going crazy or doing things that would just get you attention, right? Like, what happened to Rudy Giuliani? I mean, who knows? But he obviously couldn't just ride off into the sunset a hero. He had to be he had to be in the game.
That's such a terrible story. I mean, I mean, what he was in this country in 2001 and what he is now, I mean, it's heartbreaking. And I have to imagine, what does his family think? I mean, if he had in 2000, after his prostate cancer, if he had just said, I'm going to play golf for the rest of my life, I'm not even going to read the paper. And I think one of the lessons of the Trump years for me, and this is something I'm going to take to heart, I hope in the coming years, is you have to know when it's time to shuffle off the scene. And a lot of the people got in trouble in the Trump years because they overstayed their sell-by date. And then they were in the world and they didn't understand it, and it seemed strange and it made them upset, and they got angry, and they didn't listen enough to young people who told them it used to be like this, but it's now not like that. And I think one of the things I find really useful as a writer is I really listen to my children, 3, and not that I do everything they say or always agree with them, but they tell me what it's like for them. And that I remember being on TV, the Bill Maher show about a decade ago, and he made some dismissive comment about millennials who move in with their parent into their parents' basement. And you listen to them; they don't want to live. They want to live. I mean, I love having it when my kids have lived with us, and they've had job losses and things that have required. It's been great for me and my wife, but it's not. I can see it's not nice for them, and they want to be independent people and to understand why does it seem to be more difficult now. You really have to think about that, and they will tell you if you ask them. And I think that one of the things that a point that Anne Applebaum makes in this book of hers about her friend group and our friend group, as she and I are also very close friends, has been that one of the real inoculations against Trumpism was a close relationship with adult children.
That is super interesting. Does she go into that in the book?
She alludes with some of her Polish friends in a way. That some of the people who go most extreme are people who have very distant relationship with their adult children and are angry at them, and so she doesn't stress this point in the way I just did, but that the corollary is also true, that it helps to keep you in the world as it's becoming.
Indeed. To be continued, everybody. Get the book, Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy. David Frum, thank you for coming back on the news.
And can I say one thing to you before we go?
You may, please.
Which is, I want to say, because you've been very generous with me. I mean, when this upheaval came along, I was at a different place in my career where I had actually, in many important ways, less to worry about. I mean, you were there at a very fragile point, or not fragile, but vulnerable point in your career. And without much in the way of social safety net, you took some big risks. And I really honor that in you. And I think, I hope the listeners to your podcast understand there's a big difference between Trump coming along when you were in your 30s, I think, and when he comes along when you're in your 50s. Big difference. And the people who somebody put it this very: history throws a ball at your head, and the question is, do you flinch, or do you act right, or do you act wrong in the moment? And you did. And I hope the listeners to your podcast honor you for that.
Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you for coming back. And I hope to have you back again soon.
Bye-bye.
If you like this podcast, rate and review it on iTunes. Follow Matt on Twitter at Matt K. Lewis. Thank you for listening to Matt Lewis and the News.